So why did Judas Iscariot betray Jesus? It turns out there are many ways you could explain why he did what he did. The first way is the simplest to understand. Judas sold out, betrayed Jesus, for money. It happens, right? But see, Judas wasn't lured or groomed or bribed, because then they'd have been haggling over how much money would be worth his while. And that would have taken time and some delicacy. Instead, it is said that Judas himself went over to the chief priests. That Judas, almost without preamble, just asked the chief priests point blank, "What are you willing to give me if I hand Jesus over to you?" Dude, that's not exactly a man with a plan. So Judas is a guy who's presumably dropped everything, as it were, whether hammer or plow or fishing net, to follow Jesus. Matthew notably gave up a cushy job as tax collector for the occupying army. So Judas himself had also given up some form of livelihood to be with Jesus. He certainly hadn't signed up because he was convinced that he was going to be making more money. Now, even to the Hebrews at the time, 30 pieces of silver wasn't even a lot of money. That would have been the price of a slave at the time of Zechariah's prophecy, some 500 years earlier. So depending on which coin of the realm was used, the most those 30 pieces of silver would be worth just under $500 US today. Yeah, well, that's not a lot of money to betray your boss for. Didn't even hold out for more money. Nah, dude. It wasn't about the money. The second way to look at Judas's folly is to examine the political angle. The apostles made no secret about their hopes that Jesus would be the Messiah who the Jewish people had been waiting for centuries. The Messiah who would take up arms with them and defeat their enemies and lead them in overthrowing Roman rule. See, among other things, Jesus could turn water into wine and feed the 5,000 with a few loaves of bread and some fish, and make the blind see and the crippled walk, and even make the dead Lazarus come back to life. So it must have been really disappointing to see all that miraculous power go to waste, and be admonished instead to love their neighbor, to turn the other cheek, and worst of all, to render unto Caesar what belonged to Caesar. It must have been very confusing and frustrating. But if Judas was indeed confused and frustrated, why didn't he just exit the group quietly, go home and lick his wounds, and then bounce back to join another insurrectionist group? How did it make sense for Judas, at a pivotal time when Jesus was pulling enthusiastic crowds, being welcomed into Jerusalem, albeit riding on a donkey, and being hailed as King of the Jews? How did it make sense for Judas to take the counterintuitive, even reckless step of handing Jesus over to the chief priests instead? Does that make sense to you? So the third way would be to look at the explanation in John's Gospel that Satan had entered into Judas and had made him do easily the most famous act of betrayal in all of human history. Jesus himself said something weird to Peter toward the end of their Last Supper together. "Simon, Simon," he says in Luke 22, verses 31 to 34. "Satan has asked to sift all of you like wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail." Now we're entering into tricky territory. So taking into account free will and all, it could have been any one of the apostles then. And the temptation wouldn't have been about money. And it wouldn't have been about handing Jesus over to people considered by both zealots and Essenes as corrupt, and who were seen to be working with Rome. The seduction would have been more subtle. Judas, as passionate and idealistic as anyone who was in daily contact with Jesus would be, would need to believe that he was doing the right thing, that he was doing it for the greater good. There are some today who say Judas may have taken it upon himself to force Jesus' hand, to show his hand, as it were, in a display of power. All the power that the apostles all knew Jesus could wield to finally bring about the long-awaited new kingdom of David. Judas may not have known that they were going to kill Jesus. And he certainly could not have predicted that Jesus himself would so willingly allow them to do it. Which could explain why Judas, poor soul, could no longer live with himself. Lord Jesus crucified, have mercy on us.